to present, I'd like to introduce you to Patrick Hines with the League of Minnesota Cities. If we can welcome him, please.
Thank you for the rousing welcome. My name is Patrick Hines. I am an attorney and a lobbyist with the League of Minnesota Cities. And so my job, or part of my job, is to lobby the legislature on a whole host of issues that are important to cities and other units of government. Most of you probably know we're right in the middle of the legislative session as we speak. My boss, Gary Carlson, was slated to come here today, but he had a last-minute conflict with a committee hearing, so I drove up in his place, and I hope I can do a good enough job talking about something that may not top your list of interesting subjects, but it is an important one. It's sales taxes and the new sales tax exemption for local governments that was passed by the legislature last year and went into effect in 2014. I'll give you just some background on the sales tax exemption for local governments because I think it's important as we try to figure out what it means for you, and when we discuss it, you'll see it's a little more complicated than simply saying that you no longer have to pay sales tax on certain purchases. There was a general exemption for local government purchases in place in Minnesota until 1992. And in 1992, there was a significant budget deficit. And in order to balance the deficit, one of the things the state did was to remove that exemption. And that made purchases by cities, counties, townships, and other instrumentalities like joint powers associations, watershed districts, and those type of entities subject to the state sales tax. School districts managed to keep the sales tax exemption in place, so they've had it for a long time. Since it was put in place in 1992, the League of Minnesota Cities has been trying to get the exemption put back. From a policy standpoint, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense for one level of government to tax another level of government. But the reality was they needed some extra money, and this was a way to get it without directly increasing taxes on taxpayers. So for about 20 years, we and other groups tried to get it back, and every year we fell short, usually because there were other more politically palatable tax cuts that the legislature wanted to implement. Because at the end of the day, a local taxpayer doesn't see a check or doesn't see a direct reduction in their taxes when we exempt sales taxes, exempt purchases for local governments. It obviously has an impact on your budgets and on construction projects, and that will in turn keep property taxes down. But because there are a couple steps in between, the legislature never got around to doing it until last year, I'm happy to say. And the legislature did reinstate the exemption. They reinstated it for cities, counties, and townships. And those are the three words that they used in the law, and those words are important when we are discussing who is exempt and who is not. Because the statute, like most of the revenue statutes, are not particularly clear. And so the first issue I'll talk about is what happens to a joint powers entity. As you probably know, cities, counties, and townships are allowed by law and actually encouraged to enter into agreements to perform municipal services. It could be 4 cities creating a multi-jurisdictional police department. It could be cities providing drinking water. For example, down in Minneapolis, where I live, Minneapolis has a joint powers agreement with, I think, 7 or 8 other cities where Minneapolis's drinking water a facility provides drinking water to those cities, and they have a joint powers agreement in place to do that. When you create a separate joint powers entity, the Department of Revenue has said that's not a city, even if each member of that entity is a city. And because it's not a city, its purchases are not exempt. So we have a situation now where the St. Cloud Police Department, for example, could buy any equipment it needed, exempt from sales tax, but the South Lake Minnetonka Police Department, which consists of 4 cities, has to pay sales tax on the same purchases. Now, that's obviously not the intention of, it was not the intention of the legislature. It certainly wasn't our intention, but the law wasn't drafted perfectly, and so that's the situation we find ourselves in regarding joint powers entities. So in terms of what it means for you, if you're a city department that's providing water, your purchases are going to be exempt. If you have a joint powers entity, your purchases are not going to be exempt. If you are any other sort of what we call instrumentality, a special district, those purchases are not exempt, which again doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The taxpayer should be getting the benefit regardless of whether they get their water from a city or a joint powers entity. Your budgets should not be impacted, in our opinion, based solely on what type of entity is providing water, but that's how it is. So for those of you in those type of districts, you are still paying sales tax on your purchases. So what do we do about it? Well, the League and other groups have introduced legislation that would clarify that all of these different types of entities are exempt from paying sales tax, which sounds straightforward, but of course nothing is. And one of the issues is how much is that going to cost the state's general fund? Because when we have a tax bill like that, the department will say it cost $100 million of general fund revenue to pay for the sales tax exemption for cities, counties, and townships. But when we put that number together a year ago, we didn't include joint powers entities. We didn't include watershed districts or other instrumentalities. So it's going to cost more money. And that, of course, is always where the rubber hits the road at the Capitol when you're trying to figure out what you can get passed. And we've had estimates ranging from $9 million to $30 million. And all of those estimates will depend on which entities are getting included. If it's simply joint powers entities, it'll be smaller. If we go to watershed districts, it'll be bigger. If we go to HRAs, economic development associations, port authorities, any of those type of commissions, instrumentalities, districts, you name it, is going to cost more money to get the exemption in place. So we need to convince the legislature that this makes sense, that they need to do this, that they need to make it a priority. So one of the things that you all can do as in your organizations, speak to your representatives about what it means for your budget. If you have, if it's going to impact your budget $10,000 a year, $20,000 a year, that's real money, that's real tax money, and we think you shouldn't be charged it. We do a lot of outreach with our legislators. We have information on our website, which is LMC, LeagueofMinnesotaCities.org. If you are city employees, your city is a member of the League. We represent all cities. And so we have resources there that you can use to try to help us help you get this change through. So that's one aspect of the sales tax exemption, joint powers entities that we're trying to change. There's another provision which probably won't impact you, but I'll go over it briefly, if for no other reason, to give you some more idea of how complicated and frankly ridiculous it can be sometimes to try to get these tax changes through. In 2011, the sales tax exemption was given back to townships, but not cities, not counties. And when the legislature did that, they said, we don't want to create a situation where a local unit of government that's operating something like a golf course or a liquor store will get an unfair tax advantage over a private golf course or a private liquor store. So the law says inputs to any goods and services that are generally provided by a private business are not exempt from the sales tax. And they specifically listed a couple of things: golf courses, liquor stores, health and fitness centers, laundromats. There are actually a couple municipal laundromats out there somewhere. Sometimes if you get far away from the cities, there'll be a laundromat in the town. It'll be the only one there, and it's going to close, and the town says, got to have a laundromat, so they end up buying it and running it for a time. But anyway, so those type of goods, not tax exempt. Luckily for you, there's another group that the law says these are not provided by private businesses under any circumstance. Wastewater, drinking water, those are all covered under that exemption. So you're not going to have to worry about that, or you shouldn't be. Although I will say the Department of Revenue has come up with some interesting interpretations of the law, going so far as to say that a public ball field is generally provided by a public business and therefore is taxable. I'm not really aware of many private ball fields around here. I suppose there's a batting cage or two. When I take my kids for a walk and we go to the park, it's always the municipal park. But that's another thing that we'll be fighting over with the legislature. And again, anytime you fight to change it, there's the possibility that's going to cost money. And so when you're trying to get the exemption in place for your general purchases, these are the type of things you might be going up against. A third class of purchases, which are even more complicated than the other, have to do with construction materials and whether or not construction materials are exempt from the sales tax. Are there any of you here who have a construction project in the works now? Okay, so about 5 of you. Have you attempted to get the sales tax exemption on your construction materials purchase for this?
We looked into it, but came to the realization that it just wouldn't work.
All right, that is the answer that I get almost 90% of the time. The answer was, we looked into it and we came to the realization that it wouldn't work. And that is what we are hearing from nearly all of our cities. We do have some cities that have made it work on certain type of projects, but it really depends on the type of project that you are looking at. If you're doing a bituminous overlay on a road, there are ways that you can make it work. A more complicated project, what kind of project were you doing?
It's a recon in the street, it's water, sewer, rebuild the street, all the underground utilities.
Right. There are ways to do it, and I will go into detail about about the ways you can do it and about the ways that are required by the Department of Revenue to get this exemption. But your experience is very similar to those that we were seeing across the state. I gave a presentation to the City Engineer Association of Minnesota, and we went through all the hoops that you have to jump through in order to get the exemption, and there were a lot of frustrated engineers out there. It's always tough speaking to engineers because they're, unlike lobbyists and lawyers, they're so logical and they think very straight. And it's tough for them to get their head around the ridiculousness of the situation. And maybe I'm just jaded being a lobbyist, that I see ridiculous things all the time. But I do want to talk about how you can go through the process of getting your construction materials exempted from the sales tax, because it can be a lot of money, but as the gentleman over here said, it may not be worth it. The law says essentially that construction materials are exempt except for materials that are purchased as part of a lump sum contract or other guaranteed maximum price contract. And essentially, what they're trying to get at, we believe, is that they don't want contractors to commit fraud, and they don't want contractors to be collecting the money from the sales tax exemption. So, for instance, if a contractor had to, purchase X linear feet of lumber for a project, if they bought, 1,000 lineal feet, got the sales tax exemption, didn't pay tax on it, use 750 feet for the public project, then they've got 250 feet of lumber that they bought, didn't pay the sales tax on, use it for a private project, and charge that owner the sales tax and essentially pocket the difference. That's one of the things they're worried about. They're also worried about record keeping and figuring out how much of the material is exempt from the sales tax. That's at least what they're telling us. So in order to implement that portion of the law, Department of Revenue has a series of rules in place that are very complicated. And these rules have been in place since before 1992. So they've been there for a long time. And when I first started looking into this issue, and people were asking how we would go about doing it, my first reaction was, well, the school districts have had this in place for 20 years. I'll go ask them how they do it, because they should know. And I went on to some of the bidding websites, Quest CDN or other ones you might be familiar with, and you can look at all these public bids that are let. And I looked at a bunch of ones for schools, and none of them had the bidding formatted the way that revenue requires for the sales tax exemption. And so it surprised me a little bit, and I found the contact information for the contracting officer and gave him a call and said, how come you guys don't do it like this? And he said, we looked into it and it's just not reasonable and it's not worth the savings. And it took him a little longer to come to that answer because it had been so long since they had made that decision, he kind of forgot. So we had to do a little more digging and come up with the process from whole cloth. And so these are the steps that revenue tells you you must go through. And if you're familiar with construction projects and contracting, and I assume most of you are because you've probably had some of these projects over the years or every year, you'll see pretty quickly that it is very different from what you're used to. If you use AIA contracts, they're not set up like this. If you use any of the other standard form construction contracts, they're very different than this process. The first thing that's different is that you have to let bids separately for labor and materials. So you can't bid the whole project and just have a general contractor come back and say, we'll do it for X amount. You have to have separate bids. And not only that, you have to reserve the right to accept a low bid for materials from a different person than for the actual work. So I use the bituminous overlay because it's simple, because there's not as many moving parts, and even that doesn't work right. So you're doing the overlay, you're going to need bituminous. You've got to put a bid out for the material and then for the application. Let's say Bob's bituminous comes back with a bid on the material that's lower than Bill's, but Bill's bid on the application is lower than Bob's. So now you've got a situation where you've bought it from Bob and have to get it to Bill for him to apply it. It doesn't matter that Bob and Bill may hate each other since childhood, that they don't work well together. You are now in a situation where you've got these two entities that you have to get work together on a project. There are all sorts of problems with that. I know in the bituminous world, again, you spec it out, it's got to be in a certain range, density or something like that. Depending on where it is in the range, it's going to change how it gets applied. Well, if Bob is doing both the supply of the material and the application, then he has an incentive to put it in a certain range and to minimize his work applying it. That incentive is gone when it's his competitor who's got to apply it. He also has very little incentive to get it there on time, to facilitate the transport of it, because all he has to do is supply it. So you can see in that, even in that very simple situation, it doesn't work very well. When you've got a lot of moving parts, it works even less well. But that is the first step that you have to follow, is that separate bidding and accepting, if the bids come in that way, different bidders on the material supply side and on the application, or on the labor side, I should say, more generally. I have spoken with one city in the metro area that was doing an overlay project, and one thing that they did to try to overcome this was that they let their bid for the material first, got the bids in, opened them, announced who had it, and then let the bid for the application. And at least at that point, if Bill hated Bob, Bill didn't have to bother to put in a bid if he didn't want to work with them. And they are hoping that that will at least make it a little more clear for the people submitting the bids for the labor what they're dealing with. Now, I don't know if I don't think they've gotten the bids on the labor yet, so I don't know how it worked out, but that's one of the creative ways I've heard of people trying to deal with this. Yes, a question?
We're looking at a situation, and we're actually looking at it from the exact opposite side of the coin, because we want to make the contractor who can actually do the work take responsibility for all estimates and the amount of material needed, so that the municipality can't be liable for any hang-ups or delays of the job. So we would like to get the labor side done first, get that taken care of, and then go directly to the manufacturer for the supplies, as opposed to just bring a general bid out to contractors. Does that sound reasonable, or?
Yeah, and I'll repeat the question in case you didn't hear that he said, but and in their project they were looking at it in the opposite direction, and that they would do the labor first because they want the general to do the estimates on how much material is needed, and then when they have that, they will go out and get the material. I think that's essentially what you're asking. There are a couple points on that, and one, and maybe I should have made this point first on the contracting thing, but if the city or the entity, the exempt entity, purchases the product directly from the supplier, then it is exempt. So for the school case that I talked about, the contracting officer said, we're doing an auditorium. I know we need 200 seats. So I'm going to go buy the seats directly from the supplier so I can get the exemption. I've got an HVAC system. It's spec'd out. I know exactly what train, model number, HVAC I need. I can go to train, buy that directly. It gets delivered to the site. I sign it over to the contractor for the install. I can get the sales tax exemption on that without going through the hoops that revenue makes us go through. So in your situation, if you have if that contractor who got the labor bid provides you with the list of the materials, and you go out and buy them, they could be exempt that way. There are some funky rules about that type of scenario that can get pretty specific, and they are designed essentially to prevent people from doing an end run on one of the requirements of the law. So if you don't mind, I'll get back to that, because I think if I explain this other requirement, then it'll kind of create a clearer picture. And it also has to do with what you were talking about not wanting the city to assume the liability for all of these materials. In order for the contractor to purchase the materials on behalf of the city, you have to enter into a purchasing agent agreement with the contractor, making the contractor your agent. So that agency relationship to the Department of Revenue is important, so that it's, even though the contractor might be going to the lumber yard to buy the materials, he's buying it as the city. It's a bit of a legal, again, it's one of those legal hoops that doesn't make a lot of sense in the real world, because Bob the builder is still the same guy going to Home Depot buying the materials for this project. But what's really important about that purchasing agent agreement, besides the fact that it is another hoop and another 3-page document that you have to have prepared and put together, is that the risk of loss on the material is required to be shifted to the city, the same way that if you bought it directly from Home Depot. So that is one of the most important hang-ups in this whole process, because traditionally you bid a contract, the general contractor has contractual relationships with the suppliers. If you do your street project and the pavement fails, the sewer pipes fail, you call up your contractor and say, you better fix it. And if the contractor says, well, you know, it really was the bituminous itself, it wasn't the way I applied it, from a city perspective, I don't care. You're responsible for the project, not just for applying it, so you got to get it fixed, and you're liable for it. And if there's a lawsuit, it's your insurance that's on the hook for it, not mine. With this purchasing agent agreement, the city's got to take on the responsibility, the liability for the materials. So in the bituminous example again, if it fails and the city calls the contractor and says, what happened? Contractor says, oh, I applied it the way I was supposed to. It's the material. And that's your responsibility. And so now you're dealing with the contractor who says it's the material, and you go to Bob, who supplied the material, and you say, hey, the material was faulty, and what is he going to say? He's going to say, exactly, he's going to say, no, it wasn't me, it was Bill. He's the one who screwed it up because he doesn't know what he's doing. And now, instead of having one general contractor responsible for everything, you've got the city in this sort of love triangle between Bob, Bill, and you're out a lot of money, and you're out a lot of hassle, and you've got litigation. Yes, another question.
If you have an inspector on site doing that, that kind of takes the liability to
The question was, if you have an inspector on site doing that, would that take away some of the liability? If the inspector, you know, it's possible. I mean, if the inspector would have had to have raised a question and said, this is wrong, and if someone still went ahead and did it, I suppose. But if the inspector had inspected it and said, it looks good, and then it wasn't, I think you're still going to be in the same position of trying to sort out who's responsible for the issue. And so it's that risk shifting, which is really one of the most difficult parts of the whole scenario. And if we go back to your question over here, talking about the liability, there is that purchasing agent requirement that revenue has, which creates some problems and creates some unique circumstances in the rule, because they have very specific, in the rules, they sort of lay out what you have to do, and then they give examples. And so they'll say, example, that you let this bid and Bob comes in at lower at the material than Bill comes in, and if you do this, it's exempt. Or if you do it this way, it's not. And there's a provision which I don't think is exactly what you were talking about, but close, where you would have a contractor essentially say, I've got a bid from subcontractor A. This is where we can buy it from. It's going to be this amount of money. And he basically does all the work, tells the city, this is where I'm getting it from, this is how much it's going to cost. The city approves that bid as one contract, and then the contractor just goes and buys it like that. That wouldn't fly necessarily, because you still need to have that agency relationship, and the most important part of that agency relationship is shifting the risk onto the city, which we really don't like. It's just a bad policy. It's a hassle. And for those of you who don't know, the League of Minnesota Cities also insures cities. That is, most of the people who work in my building are not lobbyists and not research attorneys, but are underwriters and loss control and all the other doing all the other insurance tasks that I don't fully understand. So we understand that shifting liability very well and don't like it for our cities. So I don't know if that answered your question or if you had a follow-up, but so purchasing agent agreement, I think that's essentially, that's the, I guess there's not much more on the purchasing agent agreement. So what does a purchasing agent agreement look like? We do have examples on our league website Again, lmc.org. We have a memorandum on purchasing construction materials and making sure you have the exemption in place. If you go to our website and just search sales tax, it'll pop up, and you can read through a memorandum that goes through part of the steps that I'm going through now. It also has a link to a purchasing agent agreement that you are free to use. Again, if you're a city, you're a member, but this is all available online to the general public anyway. And it also has contact information for people. You can follow up with us directly if you have questions. We're happy to help. And actually, I, from a lobbying perspective, like to get these questions because they're great examples that I can use when I talk to legislators. I met with the city administrator from Delano. We were at a lunch together, and he told me about the 3 construction projects they were working on and how much trouble they had. He also mentioned that he knows his House member well, and I said, well, give him a call or email him and let him know it's a hassle. And then I get a call from the legislator saying, are you introducing this bill? Let me know, I'll sign on. So we really do like questions. That's what we're there for. So please feel free to do that. Let me just check my notes real quick because I lost my place. And I should go back and also mention that's the construction materials side. That is the most complicated provision we are dealing with. And again, because it's been in place for many years, the Department of Revenue isn't keen on eliminating it. And again, if we do eliminate it, it's going to cost money. So how are we trying to fix it? One of the proposals that I put together was sort of the hatchet approach, which was simply to delete all the rules that the Department of Revenue had adopted over the years and simply say construction materials are going to be treated the same way as any other purchase. So you would fill out your ST3 form. Anyone familiar with the ST3 form? Yes, I see heads and hands. Why don't we just use that instead of going through all this rigmarole? I mean, everyone knows that we're going to have to do paperwork with the Department of Revenue. We're not trying to eliminate paperwork. We get that. It's a question of how much is too much, and really whether you're fundamentally altering the way you contract. So we've said, well, why don't we just use the ST3 form, do it that way. They weren't crazy about that. The other option is to do it as a refund. There are many specific tax proposals in statute that relate to a specific building project. I don't know if any of you heard about the Destination Medical Center down in Rochester. They've got a separate chunk of the sales tax statute that applies to them. The Duluth Aquarium, lots of these big public projects have separate provisions, and the Department of Revenue says, well, you just apply for the refund through our existing refund system. Now, we would much prefer the upfront exemption. You don't have to pay for it and then get the refund. It eliminates paperwork. We've been going through this with the capital equipment exemption for many years, but it's preferable to the system we have in place now. So I think we will be trying to convince the legislature to let you at least apply for a refund for those materials. So you would have to pay it up front. But the advantage of the refund is, and I don't understand why the Department of Revenue has trouble getting this, they seem to think that that the amount of materials used on a project is some mysterious secret number. Before I worked at the League, I was in private practice and I did construction litigation. And we did some big projects, and I was the young attorney, and so when the general contractor contacted us and said, okay, you wanted all of our documents, we got them, come on down to the trailer. And we'd go into this trailer. It was about 10 degrees outside. They had a space heater about this big, and you're in your suit covered in dust, looking through 100 banker's boxes filled of documents telling you, almost down to the nail how much they spent on materials. So you're not doing these projects without knowing what you bought. So we do think it should be fairly simple for people to get that information. It's a bit of a pain in the neck. Yeah, do you want to have a box of bills of lading that you've got to present to the Department of Revenue? No, but on a big project, 7.5%, 8% is a significant.